The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty swing sets of Pinebrook Elementary, their chains swaying in the mountain breeze with a hollow, metallic song that no child would ever hear again. Sheriff Diana Krause stepped out of her patrol car at 7:43 a.m. on September 15, 1997, her boots crunching on frost-covered gravel as she stared at a town that had somehow lost every single one of its 697 residents in a single night. What happened in this remote Colorado mountain community would challenge everything we think we know about how people simply vanish from the face of the earth. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. And if you're ready to uncover one of America's most baffling disappearances, hit that like button and subscribe for more mysteries that defy explanation. Diana had received the first call at 6:15 that morning from a truck driver named Marcus Chen, whose regular route took him through Pinebrook on his way to deliver supplies to the ski resorts in Summit County. Marcus had been making this same drive for 12 years, stopping at Hartwell's General Store for coffee and a breakfast burrito every Tuesday and Friday without fail. But that morning, Hartwell stood dark and empty, its front door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The truck driver's voice had cracked over the radio as he described the scene. "Sheriff, there ain't nobody here. I mean nobody. Cars are still in driveways. Front doors are wide open, but it's like everybody just walked away." Marcus had spent 20 minutes driving through Pinebrook's tree-lined streets, honking his horn and calling out, before the silence finally drove him to his radio. Pinebrook, nestled in a valley 42 miles northwest of Boulder, connected to the outside world by a single winding mountain road that snaked through stands of aspen and pine. The town had been founded in 1893 by copper miners, though by 1997, it had transformed into a quiet retreat for Denver commuters who craved mountain air and the kind of small-town atmosphere where neighbors knew each other's names and children could ride their bikes until dark without fear. Diana knew these streets by heart. She had grown up in neighboring Millfield, 15 miles down the mountain, and had patrolled this area for 8 years. Pinebrook was the kind of place where the biggest crime was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower or old Pete Morrison getting too friendly with his bourbon on a Saturday night. The town had exactly 47 houses, one general store, a small post office, and a volunteer fire station that doubled as the community center. As Diana drove through the empty streets that morning, her radio crackling with static, she noticed details that would haunt her for decades. Breakfast plates sat half-finished on kitchen tables, visible through open windows. A child's tricycle lay on its side in the middle of Pine Street, its red paint gleaming in the morning sun. The flag at the post office hung at half-mast, though no one could later remember why it had been lowered or who had lowered it. The silence was absolute. No hum of electricity, no distant sound of traffic from the highway, no birds singing in the towering pines that surrounded the town like silent sentinels. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Diana made her way to the town hall, a modest brick building that served as Pinebrook's civic heart. Inside the town hall, she found something that would become central to the investigation. The emergency call log, maintained by volunteer dispatcher Jenny Walsh, showed the last entry at 11:57 p.m. on September 14th. Jenny had logged a call about a disturbance in the sky from resident Thomas Brennan, who lived on the north edge of town. The entry was incomplete, ending mid-sentence with the words, "Tom says there's something wrong with the..." What had Thomas Brennan seen in those final minutes before Pinebrook fell silent? And why had Jenny Walsh never finished writing his report? The answer would lead investigators down a path stranger than anyone could have imagined, involving secret government experiments, unexplained atmospheric phenomena, and evidence that some disappearances are meant to stay unsolved forever. Thomas Brennan's front door stood ajar, revealing a slice of darkness that seemed to swallow the morning light whole, while his coffee mug sat on the porch railing, still warm to the touch 3 hours after sunrise. Diana's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her radio, knowing that whatever she found inside this modest ranch house would either provide answers or deepen the mystery beyond all comprehension. If 697 people could vanish without a trace, then understanding how it happened might be the key to preventing it from happening again. Diana pushed through the front door of the Brennan house at 8:21 a.m., her footsteps muffled by a thick burgundy carpet that Thomas's late wife Margaret had installed 15 years earlier. The air inside carried the lingering scent of bacon and coffee, as if breakfast had been interrupted rather than abandoned. Family photos lined the hallway walls. Thomas at his retirement party from the Postal Service, grandchildren opening Christmas presents, Margaret in her garden before the cancer took her. The living room told a story, frozen in time. Thomas's recliner sat pulled back in the fully reclined position, a crossword puzzle book balanced on the armrest, with a pencil still wedged between pages 43 and 44. The television flickered with static snow, its volume turned down low, but it was the telephone that caught Diana's attention, an old rotary model that Thomas had refused to replace, its handset dangling from its cord like a question mark suspended in midair. According to FBI statistics, 97% of missing persons cases involve some form of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings scattered, furniture overturned, signs of panic or coercion. Thomas Brennan's house showed none of these indicators. Diana followed the phone cord with her eyes, tracing it from the wall jack to where it disappeared behind Thomas's chair. She found the emergency services number, 7-digit in those days for rural Colorado, written in Thomas's careful handwriting on a notepad beside the phone. Below it, in increasingly shaky script, were 3 words that would launch a federal investigation: sky turning black. The kitchen window faced north, offering a clear view across Pinebrook's residential district toward the tree line where the Arapahoe National Forest began. Diana pressed her face to the glass, trying to see what Thomas had seen in his final moments of consciousness. The mountains rose like sleeping giants beyond the town limits, their peaks still dusted with early snow that caught the morning sun like scattered diamonds. She found Thomas's jacket hanging on the back porch, its pockets containing his usual daily items: reading glasses, a worn leather wallet with $83 in cash, and a small notebook where he recorded bird sightings. The final entry, dated September 14th, read, "Red-winged blackbird, unusual altitude, flying erratically toward town center, 10:45 p.m." Diana had grown up watching her grandfather track wildlife migration patterns through these same mountains. Birds, he had taught her, were nature's early warning system, sensitive to atmospheric pressure changes, magnetic field disturbances, and other phenomena that humans couldn't detect until it was too late. What had spooked an entire flock of blackbirds into abandoning their normal flight patterns just minutes before Thomas Brennan made his emergency call? The back porch offered another clue that would prove crucial to federal investigators. Thomas's telescope, a modest but well-maintained instrument he used for stargazing, remained set up and pointed toward a specific section of sky directly above downtown Pinebrook. Diana peered through the eyepiece, adjusting the focus, until the town center came into sharp relief. She could see the post office, Hartwell's general store, and the small park where children played every afternoon after school. But something was wrong with the view. The air above the town center seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, even though the September morning was crisp and cool. Diana blinked hard and looked again, wondering if fatigue was playing tricks on her perception. The shimmering persisted. She pulled out her department-issued camera and photographed what she saw through the telescope, though she couldn't articulate exactly what that was. The film would later reveal distortions in the image that experts would struggle to explain, areas where the photograph seemed to bend light in ways that defied conventional optics. Diana's radio crackled to life at 8:57 a.m. with a call from Deputy Jake Morrison back at headquarters in Millfield. "Sheriff, you need to hear this. We just got a call from the State Patrol. Seems like 3 other towns reported weird atmospheric disturbances last night, all within a 100-mile radius of your location." The implications hit Diana like cold mountain air rushing through her lungs. If whatever happened to Pinebrook had been detected across multiple locations, then this wasn't an isolated incident involving local factors like gas leaks or contaminated water supplies. This was something much larger, something that suggested coordinated activity on a scale that small-town law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle. But as Diana prepared to call for federal assistance, she discovered evidence in Thomas Brennan's house that would make her question whether the authorities could be trusted with the truth about what really happened to Pinebrook's missing residents. 3 black helicopters appeared over the mountain ridgeline at exactly 11:14 a.m., their rotors cutting through the thin Colorado air with military precision as they descended toward Pinebrook's empty streets like mechanical vultures drawn to carrion. Diana watched from Thomas Brennan's back porch as the lead aircraft settled onto the high school football field. Disgorging, a team of men in dark suits who moved with the calculated efficiency of people accustomed to cleaning up messes that officially never happened. When federal agents arrive within 4 hours of a local incident, it means they were already watching before anything went wrong. The lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Richard Vasquez from a division of the Department of Energy that Diana had never heard of, something called the Atmospheric Phenomena Investigation Unit. Vasquez was a compact man in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested most of his work happened underground or in windowless offices. He spoke in the measured cadence of someone reading from a script, explaining that his team specialized in unusual weather events that might impact national security. Diana had dealt with federal agents before, during a bank robbery investigation that crossed state lines, but those FBI agents had been forthcoming about their procedures and authority. Vasquez and his team operated under different rules. When she asked to see identification beyond his badge, Vasquez produced a laminated card with his photo and a seal she didn't recognize, some kind of eagle with lightning bolts in its talons. "Sheriff Krause," Vasquez said, his voice carrying the flat inflection of someone who had delivered similar speeches many times before, "we're going to need you to restrict access to Pinebrook until our investigation is complete. That includes your deputies, State Patrol, and any civilians who might be curious about what happened here." The speed of their response suggested preparation. But preparation for what? Natural disasters required coordination time, but this felt more like the execution of an existing protocol. Diana led Vasquez and 2 other agents through Thomas Brennan's house, pointing out the details she had documented that morning. The dangling phone, the unfinished crossword, the telescope pointed at downtown. But as she spoke, she noticed the agents paying particular attention to things she hadn't mentioned: the electrical outlets, the light fixtures, even the metal coat hangers in Thomas's closet. One agent, a severe-looking woman who introduced herself only as Agent Chen, produced a device that resembled a Geiger counter crossed with a radar detector. The instrument clicked softly as she swept it across Thomas's living room, but the clicking accelerated dramatically when she approached the north-facing window where Thomas would have been looking when he made his emergency call. "Elevated electromagnetic readings," Agent Chen announced in a tone that suggested this was exactly what she had expected to find, consistent with high-altitude ionospheric disturbance. Diana had grown up in Colorado mountains, where summer lightning storms could turn the sky into a light show that lasted for hours. She knew what electromagnetic disturbance looked like: power lines arcing, radio static, electronics failing. But those storms left evidence: burned trees, power outages, damaged equipment. Pinebrook showed none of those signs. At 12:33 p.m., more vehicles arrived via the winding mountain road, not government sedans or emergency response trucks, but a convoy of white panel vans with tinted windows and no identifying markings. The vans parked in a precise formation around the town center, and teams of technicians in matching coveralls began unloading equipment that Diana couldn't identify. When she asked Vasquez what the technicians were doing, he explained they were conducting atmospheric sampling to determine if any environmental factors had contributed to the mass evacuation. But Diana noticed they weren't testing air quality or soil contamination. Instead, they were installing what looked like metal sensors on telephone poles and rooftops throughout Pinebrook. "Agent Vasquez," Diana said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to project during 8 years of law enforcement. "I need to understand what's really happening here. 697 people don't just walk away from their lives without leaving some kind of trail." Vasquez studied her for a long moment, as if calculating how much truth she could handle. "Sheriff, sometimes people don't walk away. Sometimes they're removed for their own protection, relocated to ensure their safety when they've witnessed something that poses a threat to national security." The word relocated hung in the mountain air like smoke from a distant fire. It suggested organization, planning, and resources that could make an entire town disappear without triggering missing persons alerts or media attention. But if the residents of Pinebrook had been relocated for their protection, why was Thomas Brennan's coffee still warm when Diana arrived that morning? And why did every house show signs of sudden, simultaneous abandonment? The answer lay in a classified file that Agent Vasquez carried in his briefcase. A file that detailed 17 similar incidents across the American West over the past 30 years, each involving communities that had witnessed phenomena the government preferred to keep hidden from public view. Agent Vasquez's briefcase clicked open at 2:47 p.m., revealing 17 manila folders arranged in chronological order, each labeled with a town name that Diana recognized from her years studying Colorado geography, but that most Americans had never heard of. The top folder, marked Clearwater Springs, 1967, contained photographs of empty houses, abandoned vehicles, and the same eerie stillness that now permeated Pinebrook's mountain streets. If this had happened 16 times before, then Pinebrook wasn't a mystery. It was part of a pattern that someone had been tracking and covering up for 3 decades. Diana spread the folders across Thomas Brennan's kitchen table, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years reviewing case files and police reports. Each folder contained the same elements: before and after photographs, witness statements from neighboring communities, and official explanations that grew increasingly creative with each incident. Clearwater Springs, population 412, had voluntarily evacuated due to unstable mining conditions in 1967. The residents were supposedly relocated to various cities throughout Colorado, though Diana noticed that none of the files contained forwarding addresses or follow-up interviews with the relocated families. Red Mesa Township, population 208, had been temporarily evacuated due to potential chemical contamination from an undisclosed military training exercise in 1974. Again, no record of where the residents went or whether they ever attempted to return to their homes. Copper Ridge, population 639, had experienced a mass food poisoning incident requiring immediate medical evacuation to multiple facilities in 1981. The town had remained empty ever since, officially listed as condemned due to ongoing health hazards that were never specifically identified. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a sociologist at Colorado State University, had published research in 1993 showing that rural American communities experienced population decline at predictable rates based on economic factors, employment opportunities, and proximity to urban centers. But these 17 towns had emptied overnight, simultaneously, with no advance warning or gradual migration patterns. "Agent Vasquez," Diana said, her finger tracing the timeline of incidents across the folders. "These towns are all located within specific geographic boundaries. They're all in mountain valleys, all isolated by single-access roads, and all positioned at similar elevations above sea level." Vasquez nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for her to notice this pattern. "Sheriff, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of government security. The phenomena that affected these communities represents technology that most people aren't ready to understand." The word technology struck Diana like a physical blow. She had been thinking in terms of natural disasters, atmospheric anomalies, or even mass hysteria. But technology suggested human agency, deliberate action, and the possibility that the disappearances weren't random events, but targeted operations. Through the kitchen window, she could see Agent Chen and her team installing their mysterious sensors throughout Pinebrook's residential district. The devices resembled small satellite dishes, each one precisely positioned to face the same section of sky that Thomas Brennan had been observing through his telescope. "What kind of technology are we talking about?" Diana asked, though part of her already suspected that the answer would challenge everything she thought she understood about the limits of human capability. Vasquez opened another folder, this one containing technical diagrams that resembled blueprints for aircraft, but with design elements that Diana had never seen before. The craft, if that's what they were, had no visible propulsion systems, no wings or rotors, and geometric configurations that seemed to defy basic principles of aerodynamics. "Sheriff, since 1947, the United States government has been reverse engineering technology recovered from sources that remain classified. Some of that technology has applications for transportation, communication, and what we might call selective relocation of human populations." The implications crashed over Diana like an avalanche of understanding. The residents of Pinebrook hadn't walked away from their lives or been evacuated due to natural disasters. They had been removed by technology that the government had been developing and testing for 50 years. But why these particular towns? And why did the pattern suggest accelerating frequency over the past decade? At 3:22 p.m., Agent Chen approached the kitchen window and tapped on the glass with urgency that made Diana's stomach clench with dread. Through the window, Chen pointed toward the sky above downtown Pinebrook, where the air had begun to shimmer with the same distortion that Diana had noticed earlier through Thomas Brennan's telescope. The shimmering was growing more intense, creating visible waves in the atmosphere that bent light like water, refracting through a prism. And within those waves, something was taking shape, something that would force Diana to confront the possibility that the missing residents of Pinebrook weren't gone at all, but had been transported to a location that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional geography. Vasquez closed his briefcase with mechanical precision and walked toward the door. "Sheriff, what happens next will determine whether you become part of the official record or whether you join the residents of Pinebrook in a place where the normal rules of time and space don't apply." But as the shimmering intensified above the town center, Diana realized that the choice between staying silent and seeking the truth had already been made for her by forces that had been orchestrating these disappearances since before she was born. The air above Pinebrook's town center began to fold in on itself at 3:29 p.m., creating geometric patterns that hurt Diana's eyes to look at directly, as if reality were originating like paper and revealing something that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Agent Vasquez grabbed her shoulder with surprising strength, pulling her away from the kitchen window as the shimmering intensified into something that resembled a massive lens, focusing invisible light into visible impossibility. When witnesses see too much of what governments prefer to keep hidden, those witnesses face a choice that isn't really a choice at all. forget everything, or disappear forever. Don't look directly at it, Vasquez commanded, his previous calm demeanor replaced by urgency that bordered on panic. The visual cortex can't process what you're seeing without permanent damage. We've had observers suffer complete psychological breaks from 30 seconds of direct exposure. But Diana was a sheriff who had spent 8 years investigating scenes that most people couldn't handle. Car accidents that scattered human remains across mountain highways. Domestic violence calls that revealed the worst of human nature. Overdose deaths that left families shattered beyond repair. She had learned to compartmentalize horror, to observe without being overwhelmed. This was different. This made her mind feel like it was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that existed in dimensions her brain couldn't access. Agent Chen burst through the front door at 3:31 p.m., her electromagnetic detection device clicking so rapidly it sounded like electronic rain falling on metal. "Sir, we're reading energy signatures that exceed our measurement capabilities. Whatever's happening up there is drawing power from sources we can't identify." Through the window, Diana caught glimpses of the phenomenon, despite Vasquez's warnings. The air above downtown wasn't just shimmering anymore, it was opening, like someone unzipping the sky to reveal something that had been hidden behind the blue facade of normal atmospheric conditions. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a theoretical physicist at CERN, had published papers in 1995 suggesting that space-time could be manipulated through the application of precisely calibrated electromagnetic fields. Her research had been declassified briefly, then reclassified at levels so high that even mentioning her work could result in federal prosecution. Diana began to understand why. "Agent Vasquez," she said, her voice steady despite the impossible scene unfolding outside. "How many people have witnessed what I'm witnessing right now?" Vasquez consulted a small notebook with pages that looked like they had been filled and refilled many times. "Including yourself, Sheriff, 43 individuals over the past 30 years. 12 chose to accept relocation to secure facilities where they could receive psychological support while maintaining appropriate security clearances. 15 chose to accept memory modification procedures that allowed them to return to normal lives." Diana felt ice forming in her stomach. What happened to the other 16? They chose to join the communities they were investigating. The phrase hung in the air, like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Diana understood that chose was probably not accurate, but she also understood that whatever had happened to those 16 witnesses had been thorough enough that none of them had ever surfaced to tell their stories. At 3:34 p.m., the opening in the sky above Pinebrook became visible to the naked eye as a dark circle that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But around the edges of that darkness, Diana could see movement, shapes that might have been buildings or vehicles, arranged in patterns that suggested organized settlement rather than random displacement. "They're not dead," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of absolute certainty. "The residents of Pinebrook, the people from those other 16 towns, they're somewhere else, somewhere that exists parallel to here, but separate from here." Agent Chen's equipment registered a massive electromagnetic surge, and suddenly, the air above downtown Pinebrook filled with sounds, voices calling to each other, children laughing, the distant hum of what might have been machinery or vehicles operating according to principles that terrestrial physics couldn't explain. Diana recognized some of the voices. Mrs. Patterson from the post office calling someone named Sarah to dinner, Tommy Hendricks, the high school quarterback, arguing with friends about weekend plans. Normal human conversations drifting down from a location that existed somewhere beyond the sky but parallel to the earth. "This is why the witness protocol exists," Vasquez said, his voice carrying a sadness that seemed rooted in years of making impossible decisions. "Most people can't handle the knowledge that reality has layers, that the world they think they live in is just the visible surface of something much more complex. But as Diana listened to the voices of Pinebrook's missing residents echoing from somewhere above the mountain valley, she realized that understanding the truth about their disappearance was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. The technology that could relocate entire communities to parallel dimensions had been in government hands for decades. But who had developed it originally, and why were the relocations accelerating in frequency as the millennium approached? At 3:37 p.m., the opening in the sky began to contract, the voices fading like radio signals being tuned to different frequencies. Agent Vasquez produced a small device that resembled a television remote control, its buttons labeled with symbols that didn't correspond to any alphabet Diana recognized. "Sheriff," he said, his thumb hovering over the central button, "it's time for you to make your choice. But understand that once you decide, there's no changing your mind, and there's no going back to the person you were before you witnessed what you witnessed today." But as Diana stared at the device in Vasquez's hand, she realized that her choice had already been made by something much larger than personal preference or career considerations. It had been made by the same force that had been orchestrating these relocations for 30 years, and that force was finally ready to reveal why it had been moving people from one layer of reality to another. The remote control in Agent Vasquez's hand began to pulse with soft blue light at 3:39 p.m., its alien symbols shifting and rearranging themselves like living text responding to electromagnetic fields that Diana's equipment couldn't detect. But before Vasquez could activate whatever protocol the device controlled, the contracted opening above Pinebrook suddenly expanded again, and something began to descend through the dimensional tear with the deliberate precision of an elevator moving between floors of reality. What emerged from that impossible aperture would redefine humanity's understanding of its place in a universe far more crowded and complex than anyone had dared to imagine. The craft that descended through the opening defied every principle of aerodynamics that Diana had learned during her brief stint in the Colorado National Guard. It had no wings, no visible propulsion system, and no apparent concern for gravity as it settled onto Main Street with the gentle precision of a soap bubble landing on still water. The hull reflected light in ways that hurt to observe directly, creating rainbow patterns that seemed to exist in spectrums beyond normal human vision. Dr. James Morrison, a materials scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, had published classified research in 1989 describing alloys that could manipulate electromagnetic fields to achieve selective interaction with gravitational forces. His work had been buried so deeply that even mentioning his name required security clearances that most government officials didn't possess. Diana was beginning to understand why certain scientific discoveries never reached public awareness. Agent Chen's instruments went silent as the craft settled completely onto the asphalt, as if the technology emanating from the vessel operated on frequencies that terrestrial electronics couldn't register. But the silence from her equipment was replaced by something far more unsettling: the sound of car doors opening and closing from empty vehicles parked throughout Pinebrook, as if invisible residents were going about their daily routines, in perfect synchronization with activities happening in the parallel dimension above. "Sheriff Krause," a voice said from directly behind her, though Diana hadn't heard anyone enter Thomas Brennan's house. She turned to find a figure that appeared human at first glance, but possessed subtle characteristics that marked it as something else entirely. The being stood exactly 6 feet tall, with proportions that seemed mathematically perfect, skin that reflected light with the same impossible quality as the craft outside, and eyes that held intelligence spanning centuries rather than decades. The entity introduced itself as Coordinator Matthias, a designation that suggested bureaucratic function rather than personal identity. It spoke English with no accent, as if language were simply a tool it had mastered, along with countless others, during a career that spanned multiple civilizations. "Agent Vasquez has done excellent work," maintaining the security protocols we established in 1947. Coordinator Matthias said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in Diana's bones. But the accelerating timeline requires modifications to our standard procedures. Diana felt pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place with mechanical precision. The government hadn't been reverse engineering crashed alien technology. They had been working in partnership with non-human intelligence to manage something that posed a threat to both species. The 17 towns, she said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect under these circumstances. They weren't relocated for their protection. They were relocated because they witnessed something that proved extraterrestrial intelligence was actively involved in terrestrial affairs. Coordinator Matthias nodded with approval that felt like sunlight, warming her skin. Sheriff, your species is approaching technological capabilities that will allow them to detect our presence regardless of our concealment efforts. The communities we've relocated serve as cultural preserves, maintaining authentic human social structures in environments where they can develop naturally without interference from the dimensional transition your civilization will undergo within the next 3 decades. The implications cascaded through Diana's mind like an avalanche of understanding. Humanity was being prepared for contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, but the preparation involved selectively removing communities that had gained premature awareness of that intelligence. Pinebrook's residents weren't victims, they were pioneers. At 3:57 p.m., Coordinator Matthias gestured toward the window, where the dimensional opening still hung above the town center, like a portal between worlds. Through that aperture, Diana could see structures that resembled terrestrial architecture, but incorporated design elements that suggested collaboration between human creativity and non-human engineering capabilities. Would you like to see where they went? Coordinator Matthias asked, extending a hand that felt warm and entirely human, despite belonging to something that had traveled between stars. Your choice now determines not just your own future, but whether you become an advocate for your species during the transition period that begins in earnest next year. Agent Vasquez lowered his remote control device, and Diana realized that the witness protocol had never been about protecting government secrets. It had been about identifying humans who possess the psychological flexibility to serve as liaisons between species during humanity's graduation into galactic civilization. But as Diana reached toward Coordinator Matthias's outstretched hand, she noticed that Agent Chen had been recording everything with equipment far more sophisticated than anything she had previously displayed, and that the data being collected would determine how quickly humanity's transition proceeded. The choice Diana made in the next few seconds would influence not just her own destiny, but the timeline for revealing extraterrestrial partnership to the 7 billion people who still believed they lived on a planet that had never been visited by intelligence from other worlds. Diana's fingertips touched Coordinator Matthias's palm at 4:03 p.m., and reality dissolved like sugar and rain as her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of linear time and three-dimensional space, revealing a timeline where humanity's integration into galactic civilization had been orchestrated for 73 years with surgical precision. The sensation felt like falling upward through layers of existence she had never known were stacked beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, each layer revealing new depths of collaborative planning between human and non-human intelligence. What she discovered in those expanded moments of perception would determine whether humanity's awakening proceeded gradually over decades or accelerated into a revelation that most minds weren't prepared to process. The first thing Diana noticed was that she could still see Thomas Brennan's kitchen, but now she could see it from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. She witnessed Thomas making his final phone call on September 14th, but she also saw him 3 weeks earlier installing new batteries in his telescope, guided by subtle intuitions that he attributed to stargazing enthusiasm, but that actually originated from psychic suggestions transmitted through the dimensional barrier. Agent Chen's recording equipment wasn't just documenting Diana's encounter with Coordinator Matthias. It was measuring her neurological responses to determine how quickly other humans could be introduced to multidimensional awareness without suffering permanent psychological damage. Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, a neuroscientist at Stanford Research Institute, had published classified studies in 1994 showing that human consciousness could adapt to nonlinear temporal perception if introduced gradually through controlled exposure to what she termed reality flexibility exercises. Her research had been immediately reclassified, and her laboratory funding redirected to projects that officially didn't exist. Diana understood why. The ability to perceive multiple dimensions of time and space simultaneously wasn't a natural human capability. It was a gift being gradually introduced to selected individuals who could serve as bridges between humanity's current limitations and its expanded future potential. Sheriff Krause, Coordinator Matthias said, its voice reaching her through channels that bypassed her auditory processing and spoke directly to her consciousness. You're experiencing temporal perception enhancement. This allows you to understand the full scope of the integration timeline without losing psychological stability. Through her expanded awareness, Diana could see the pattern that connected all 17 disappeared communities across a 70-year timeline. Each relocation had served as a testing ground for different aspects of human extraterrestrial collaboration. Clearwater Springs had tested agricultural techniques that would be necessary for feeding expanding populations during dimensional transition. Red Mesa Township had experimented with educational systems designed to prepare children for contact with non-human intelligence. Pinebrook was serving as a model for complete community integration, where humans and extraterrestrial coordinators worked together to develop social structures that could function across multiple dimensions of reality. The timeline has changed, Coordinator Matthias explained, as Diana watched scenes from Pinebrook's relocated residents adapting to their new environment with enthusiasm that surprised her. Your species' technological advancement has accelerated beyond our original projections. What we plan to reveal gradually over 30 years now needs to happen within the next 18 months. The implications struck Diana like lightning, illuminating a landscape she had never seen before. The government's partnership with extraterrestrial intelligence wasn't a conspiracy to hide alien contact. It was a collaboration to manage humanity's graduation into galactic civilization at a pace that wouldn't trigger mass psychological breakdown. But something had changed the timeline. At 4:17 p.m., Agent Chen approached with data readings that made Coordinator Matthias's perfect features show the first signs of concern Diana had witnessed. The electromagnetic signatures emanating from the dimensional portal above Pinebrook were being detected by amateur radio operators, atmospheric researchers, and satellite monitoring stations across Colorado and neighboring states. How many people have recorded anomalous readings in the past 4 hours? Diana asked. Though her enhanced temporal perception already showed her fragments of the answer, Agent Chen consulted her instruments with movements that seemed suddenly frantic compared to her earlier mechanical precision. 47 separate detection events, Sheriff, and the readings are being shared on internet forums faster than our monitoring systems can track and suppress them. The internet. Diana realized that the careful information control systems that had managed disclosure for 7 decades were breaking down in the face of instant global communication. Amateur researchers could now coordinate observations and share data faster than any government agency could intercept and classify it. Coordinator Matthias made a gesture that Diana somehow understood meant implementation of accelerated protocols. And suddenly the sky above every one of the 17 relocated communities began opening simultaneously, creating dimensional apertures visible from dozens of population centers across the American West. Sheriff, Coordinator Matthias said, its voice carrying urgency that transcended species boundaries, Your choice in the next 60 seconds will determine whether humanity discovers extraterrestrial partnership through gradual revelation or through mass simultaneous contact that could destabilize your civilization. But as Diana processed the weight of that responsibility, she realized that the choice had already been made by forces beyond anyone's control, by technology that connected human minds faster than governments could manage information, and by a species that had reached the threshold where childhood secrecy was no longer possible. The question wasn't whether to reveal the truth about extraterrestrial partnership, but how to help 7 billion people adapt to the discovery that their planet had been under benevolent management for nearly a century, and that they were about to become active participants in an intergalactic community that spanned thousands of worlds. Amateur radio operator Jake Summers captured the first clear transmission from the parallel dimensions at 4:23 p.m. Mountain Time, his shortwave equipment in suburban Denver, picking up conversations between children playing games that followed rules no terrestrial physicist could explain. Within 90 minutes, those recordings were circulating through internet forums faster than any government agency could track them, creating a cascade of revelation that would force humanity to confront the truth about its cosmic neighborhood, whether world leaders felt prepared or not. When 7 billion people simultaneously discover that their reality has hidden layers, the psychological shockwaves can either unite a species in wonder or fragment it into panic that destroys the very civilization extraterrestrial partners had spent decades trying to protect. Jake had been monitoring atmospheric disturbances for the National Weather Service as a volunteer observer for 12 years, tracking everything from solar flare activity to unusual cloud formations over the Rocky Mountain region. But at 4:23 p.m., his equipment picked up transmissions that originated from coordinates that should have contained only empty sky 30,000 feet above former mining communities scattered across Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. The voices were unmistakably human. Children arguing about whose turn it was to feed animals that made sounds unlike anything in terrestrial zoology. Adults discussing work schedules that involved technologies with names that didn't exist in any engineering textbook. Elderly residents comparing notes about health treatments that seemed to reverse aging processes that medical science considered irreversible. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a linguistics professor at the University of Colorado, would later analyze Jake's recordings and identify 17 distinct regional dialects corresponding perfectly to the speech patterns of communities that had officially never existed or had been abandoned for decades due to various federal explanations that now seemed transparently fabricated. By 5:47 p.m., similar recordings were being reported by amateur radio operators in Arizona, Nevada, California, and Montana. Each recording captured fragments of normal human life happening in locations that existed parallel to familiar geography, but separate from the dimensional layer that most of humanity called reality. The internet transformed what should have been isolated incidents into a coordinated revelation that governments had no protocol for managing. Forum moderators on sites dedicated to unexplained phenomena found themselves overwhelmed with audio files, photographs of unusual atmospheric disturbances, and first-hand accounts from witnesses who had seen craft descending through dimensional apertures above communities that weren't supposed to exist. Diana watched this cascade of disclosure through her enhanced temporal perception, seeing the timeline of revelation compressed from decades into hours by technologies that connected human consciousness faster than any central authority could control information flow. From Thomas Brennan's kitchen, she observed fragments of the future unfolding in real time. News broadcasts struggling to explain phenomena that defied conventional scientific understanding, government officials holding emergency meetings to develop responses to questions they had hoped never to answer publicly. "Coordinator Matthias," she said, her voice steady despite witnessing the transformation of human civilization happening at speeds that should have been psychologically devastating. How many people can handle learning that reality has layers without losing their ability to function in society? Coordinator Matthias consulted information sources that existed beyond Diana's enhanced perception, though she could sense vast networks of communication connecting thousands of extraterrestrial coordinators stationed throughout human civilization. Sheriff, our projections suggest that 68% of your species will adapt to multidimensional awareness within 6 months if the revelation is managed correctly. 27% will require extended psychological support, but will eventually integrate the information successfully. The remaining 5% will reject the information completely and create alternative explanations that allow them to maintain their previous understanding of reality. At 6:14 p.m., the first news helicopter arrived over what remained of Pinebrook, its camera crew broadcasting live footage of dimensional apertures that appeared and disappeared according to patterns that terrestrial meteorology couldn't explain. The pilot, veteran traffic reporter Susan Walsh, provided commentary that mixed professional journalism with growing amazement as she described phenomena that her 40 years of aviation experience had never prepared her to witness. "This is unlike anything in our understanding of atmospheric physics," Susan reported, her voice carrying wonder rather than fear as she circled the area where Pinebrook had once stood. "We're seeing what appears to be structured openings in the sky itself, with clear evidence of organized activity visible through those openings. Agent Chen's monitoring equipment registered communication bursts between the dimensional layers, accelerating beyond measurement capacity, as if the residents of the 17 relocated communities were coordinating their own revelation activities independent of extraterrestrial coordinator protocols. The missing humans weren't passive recipients of advanced technology. They had become active participants in managing their species' introduction to galactic civilization." Diana realized that the choice she faced wasn't between individual options anymore. The residents of Pinebrook and the other 16 communities had collectively decided that humanity's integration timeline needed to accelerate, and they were using their enhanced capabilities to force disclosure at a pace that bypassed government management systems entirely. At 6:28 p.m., dimensional apertures began opening above major population centers across North America. Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, and Albuquerque all reported visible atmospheric anomalies that amateur photographers were documenting faster than any agency could suppress the evidence. Coordinator Matthias made another gesture that Diana understood meant implementation of emergency protocols, but this time the gesture carried resignation rather than control. The gradual integration timeline had collapsed entirely, replaced by mass simultaneous revelation that would test humanity's psychological flexibility in ways that no simulation had ever modeled. "Sheriff," Coordinator Matthias said, its voice now carrying harmonics of uncertainty that suggested even extraterrestrial intelligence had limitations when it came to predicting how conscious beings would respond to expanded awareness. "Your species is about to experience the fastest transition from planetary isolation to galactic citizenship in recorded cosmic history." But as dimensional apertures continued opening above population centers throughout the western United States, Diana realized that the true test wouldn't be whether humanity could adapt to the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, but whether two species could learn to collaborate as equals when their partnership was no longer hidden from the 7 billion minds that would determine Earth's role in an intergalactic community spanning thousands of worlds. President Margaret Chen addressed the nation at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on September 16, 1997, her voice carrying the weight of revelations that would redefine humanity's place in the universe as she confirmed what millions of Americans had witnessed through amateur radio transmissions, internet forums, and live television broadcasts that no government agency could suppress or explain away. Behind her, in the Oval Office, barely visible in the frame, stood two figures whose presence marked the end of 7 decades of secrecy about extraterrestrial partnership in human affairs. The next 72 hours would determine whether humanity's species graduation into galactic civilization would proceed as the greatest expansion of consciousness in recorded history, or fragment into chaos that could set back Earth's integration by centuries. Diana stood in Thomas Brennan's backyard at 8:17 p.m. Mountain Time, watching dimensional apertures stabilize above every major population center visible from the Colorado mountains. Their edges no longer shimmering with instability, but glowing with the steady radiance of permanent architectural features in Earth's expanded reality. Through her enhanced perception, she could observe the cascading effects of mass revelation spreading across continents as rapidly as satellite communications could carry the news. The residents of Pinebrook began returning at 8:23 p.m., not through the dimensional portals that had transported them to parallel communities, but walking down the familiar mountain road that connected their town to the outside world, as if they had simply been visiting neighbors and were now coming home for dinner. Thomas Brennan led the procession, his telescope balanced on his shoulder and his face showing the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from finally understanding mysteries that had puzzled him for decades. Dr. Michael Roberts, a psychiatrist specializing in mass trauma events, had published research in 1995 suggesting that human beings possessed remarkable psychological resilience when confronting paradigm shifts, provided the new information came with evidence of benevolent intent rather than hostile threat. The returning residents of Pinebrook demonstrated this resilience in ways that exceeded even optimistic projections. "Sheriff Krause," Thomas Brennan said, as he approached his house, his voice carrying energy that made him seem 20 years younger than when Diana had investigated his emergency call 36 hours earlier. "I hope you don't mind that I borrowed your office radio to coordinate with the other communities. We figured it was time to stop letting other people manage our integration timeline." Diana realized that the missing residents hadn't been passive recipients of extraterrestrial assistance. They had become active collaborators in planning humanity's transition, using their expanded awareness to design disclosure strategies that governments and coordinators had never considered. The acceleration of revelation hadn't been an emergency response to technological detection. It had been a deliberate decision by human beings who understood their species better than any external intelligence could. Mrs. Patterson from the post office emerged from one of the returning groups carrying mail that had been delivered through interdimensional postal systems connecting Earth's parallel communities with correspondence networks spanning multiple star systems. The letters she distributed to Pinebrook's residents contained news from human settlements that had been established on other worlds over the past 50 years, written in familiar handwriting by neighbors and relatives who had volunteered for off-world colonization programs that officially didn't exist. "Diana," Mrs. Patterson said, extending an envelope with the sheriff's name written in careful script, "This one's for you, from someone who says they met you during a missing persons investigation about 15 years ago." The letter was from Detective Maria Santos, whom Diana remembered as a Denver police officer who had disappeared while investigating a case involving unusual electromagnetic readings near an abandoned mining town. Maria's letter described her work establishing law enforcement protocols for human colonies in the Proxima Centauri system, where Earth's legal traditions were being adapted to function in environments with different gravitational fields and day-night cycles. At 9:47 p.m., the dimensional apertures above major cities began displaying images rather than serving as transit portals. Vast screens showing scenes of human life flourishing in environments that defied terrestrial geography. Children played in parks where trees grew in spirals that captured energy from multiple suns. Adults worked in laboratories where the laws of physics operated according to expanded principles that made faster-than-light communication possible. Elderly residents tended gardens where vegetables grew into geometric patterns that created mathematical beauty while providing enhanced nutrition. The images weren't propaganda designed to make extraterrestrial partnership appear attractive. They were documentation of authentic human adaptation to expanded possibilities, proof that Earth's species could maintain its essential character while embracing capabilities that transformed the meaning of limitation itself. Coordinator Matthias approached Diana as she finished reading Maria Santos's letter, its expression showing what she had learned to recognize as extraterrestrial satisfaction at successful completion of complex long-term projects. Sheriff, your species exceeded every projection for psychological adaptability to dimensional transition. What we estimated would require 30 years of gradual preparation, you accomplished through collective decision-making in 72 hours. Diana looked across Pinebrook's residential streets, where returning families were reuniting with neighbors who had never left, sharing stories that bridged the gap between parallel existence and conventional reality, with the easy intimacy of people who had always known that separation was temporary. Children who had spent 2 days in expanded dimensional awareness were teaching their parents games that incorporated principles of physics that wouldn't be discovered by terrestrial science for decades. What happens next? Diana asked, though her enhanced perception already showed her fragments of the answer. Integration programs that would allow voluntary participation in off-world settlements, educational exchanges that would prepare Earth's children for citizenship in galactic civilization, and collaborative projects that would position humanity as active contributors to interstellar community development rather than passive recipients of advanced assistance. Coordinator Matthias gestured toward the stars visible above Colorado's mountain peaks, where lights that had previously seemed like distant suns were now recognizably artificial constructions. Space stations, transport networks, and communication relays that connected thousands of worlds in partnerships that spanned multiple galaxies. Sheriff, it said, its voice carrying harmonics of anticipation that transcended species boundaries. Tomorrow morning, your species begins the greatest adventure in the history of consciousness itself. But as Diana watched families reuniting under skies that now revealed the true complexity of cosmic civilization, she realized that humanity's real adventure had begun the moment individuals like Thomas Brennan started asking questions about strange phenomena that authorities preferred to keep hidden, and that the courage to seek truth, regardless of comfortable illusions, had been the qualification test for species graduation all along. The mystery of Pinebrook's disappeared residents was solved, but the greater mystery of humanity's role in an infinite universe had only just begun to unfold.